Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to day one or week one of keeping your kids on God's side. So this is not the actual Sunday school class. I tried to record it, do a screen recording on Sunday, and it turns out that the program that I was using wanted me to buy it, and so they only allowed me to record 1 minute of it, and that was kind of useless because it was really I didn't even start the class at that point. So, and 1 minute with the class wasn't really going to help you anyway. So I found a program that I can use that's going to do the the full 40-ish minutes of this particular class. This is a slightly shorter class just because it's really just an introductory class. So future classes should be pretty packed with information. So hopefully I can fit all the information into the upcoming classes. That's more the concern for the upcoming classes. But today was a slightly lighter day. Really just just making my appeal as to why this class is helpful and in many ways maybe even necessary for us as we raise our kids in this ever-changing culture. So let's just jump right into it. So the author of this book, which I recommend actually, we're going to be covering almost all the content in the class. I do leave out certain information, like she has certain anecdotes where she relates her research to her own life, which it's just not particularly necessary for this class. If I had to cut something out, that was it, just for the sake of time. But I do recommend you read it. It's some of the stories are pretty funny and they are relatable. So it does make the content that we're looking into, just a little bit easier to digest. But I think, over the course of the class, we're going to be talking about our own stories, and that might relate to some of this information and some of our experiences. So at least that's my hope. But let's start with her story first. So she was a type A parent, meaning that she was kind of one of those parents that had to be in control of everything, right? She had a, let's see, because first point, she kept a log of her kids' sleep, feeding, toileting routines, the whole thing. And that's just kind of part of her personality. She's very detail oriented. She very routine, and just likes to be in control. So, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But here's the thing. So she got to this point though, where after mastering her child's need, or actually she had twins, so her children's needs. She didn't know where to go from there, right? She was like, well, okay, so now they're surviving. What do I do with them now? And she started to sense that, that's only half the battle, really, is attending their physical needs. A lot of times the secular culture will talk about tending to mental health, and in many ways, mental health is very much connected to spiritual health. And what this kind of incentivized her to instill a strong worldview, which. In the class, no one was really familiar with that term. It's not really something that's brought up all the time. But it is exactly what it sounds like. So it's a view of how you perceive the world, and it's how you explain why the world is the way it is. And there's quite a few different worldviews being thrown around these days. But one that many of us are somewhat familiar with. Well, obviously Christianity is one. That's one way of perceiving the world. There's this redemptive trajectory that started in the beginning of time when Adam sinned, and then Jesus came and bore our sins on the cross, and now we're in this church age where we're saving as many people as we can before His second coming, and then ultimately there will be the day of judgment. Which is obviously very different than the way other people view the world. From the atheist perspective, none of that's true, right? So, from the atheist perspective, we all came from amoebas, and there really is no purpose to life. It's just, the highest purpose, I guess, that they could really come up with would really be just sense gratification, because you can't say that we're serving God because there is no God. I guess you can say you're serving your family, but that's not really an ultimate purpose. In a matter of a couple generations, no one's going to remember us. So that's if you're only looking at the world from a material perspective, purpose is rather limited. And so you can see the differences between the worldviews and the implications that they have. And she felt the need to instill one of these into her kids. And just my question is, why did she suddenly feel the need? Oh, I didn't mention this. So she was actually quite apathetic about her faith. At the point, right before she became a parent, she didn't really have a strong relationship with Christ. She grew up in the church, and that was just the water she lived in, right? Was Christianity. She lived in the bubble of the church. Her parents were believers. Her friends were believers. You know, her extended family, it sounds like, was believers. And so she really had no reason to question her faith, but she wasn't really invested in it either. So, you know, when she left home, when she flew the coop, went away to college, she wasn't reading her Bible. She wasn't really attending church. She wasn't, you know, doing a lot of that stuff that you would want to do as a practicing Christian. And so she became somewhat apathetic towards her faith, and maybe it sounded like she had some doubt too that whether or not it was actually true. But suddenly, when she became a parent, she had this need to resolve this apathy and doubt. And just my question to the class was, well, why? Why go through all of college, you know, all of high school, and you know, maybe your whole dating period, and you know, she didn't feel the need to resolve it then. Well, why then? Why becoming a parent? And someone actually raised a good point. Actually, no, that was a different point. So my explanation for this was, you know, there was this kind of a subtle recognition that there is an objective right and wrong, right? There's a right way to raise your kids, and then there's a wrong way to raise your kids. And she kind of intuitively got that sense. And she, in her heart of hearts, I think she felt, well, you know, Jesus. You can't deny, like, the things that he says are true. They're moral. We kind of know them on an intuitive level. Even atheists will, you know, recognize that, like, stealing's bad, murder's bad. You know, it's not good to judge people on by the way they look. You know, you want to look deeper than that. Like, these are truths that that we'll find, you know, in the Bible that people kind of intuitively know are true. But even if they don't accept the whole thing as being true. And so she wanted to really, you know, dig deeper into this because she wanted her kids to be good kids, right? And to grow up and to be good adults. So let's dive in and see kind of where that took her. So she had a rude awakening. So you know, kind of the first stop for her, which I think is the first stop for a lot of people, just because it's kind of one of the big debates that's been going on in our society for over 100 years now, which is creation versus evolution. You know, did we come from apes, or were we created directly by God? And she was probably finding out all this cool stuff, right? Because you know, when you really dig into this, intelligent design is a fascinating discipline to look into, and really a lot of the logical explanations for the universe and the beginning of the universe make a lot more sense with an intelligent model, right? Because the alternative is that, you know, we accept that the universe began, right? And so does it make sense that it began, you know, all by itself out of nothing? Like, well, that just defies all logic. You know, nothing does that. Everything has a cause that has a beginning. And so the question is, well, did something intelligent cause it, or did something inert cause it? And you know, if you think about anything in the universe or in the world that we know, rocks don't create things. Like, inert objects don't create things. You know, intelligent things create things. You know, on some level, it has some level of awareness. So you can look at it from that perspective. So she's probably discovering like these kind of cool ideas and was posting about them in this creation versus evolution debate, and she got ridiculed. She just got clocked by the culture and just by different people around because she was blogging about it. It wasn't she started blogging about it. So you know, and that was obviously very uncomfortable for her, and she wasn't expecting it. And so my question to the class was, why do atheists and agnostics feel justified in ridiculing Christian views? And actually, intelligent design isn't necessarily even a solely Christian view. That's just a theistic view, right? That an intelligent being, because intelligent designers don't actually say that it was the God of the Bible, but it's perceived as a biblical Christian view because it fits much better in the Christian model than it does in the atheist model. But they feel, why do they feel justified in ridiculing these views? And this is where someone actually brought up a good point. Just the concept of ridicule to begin with. It's not something that Christians should be ever really going into, right? We shouldn't be moving into ridicule territory, even when we know that we're right. You know, if someone says something that's kind of silly or just doesn't make sense, you know, we want to guide them gently towards truth. We don't want to ridicule them. But, you know, if you don't have, you know, objective Christian morality, or just some form of objective morality that doesn't embrace something like ridicule, or that doesn't deny something like ridicule, then our sinful nature dictates that we're going to do that sort of behavior. So those that don't have a Christian moral backbone are much more likely to engage in ridicule type behavior than Christians. So that was something I didn't even think before I did this presentation, but I thought it was a good point. Where I kind of went with this was more kind of the justification aspect. Why do they feel justified in ridiculing Christian views? And really where that came from, where I went with that was more the institutions of power. So a lot of our institutions of power, including many of our scientific institutions, whether it's archaeology or biology or general academia, they've all kind of adopted this secular view of the world. Not all of them. I don't want to say all of them, because there are certainly scientists out there that are engaging in intelligent design, and they're looking. They don't accept evolution a priori, that it's just this basic truth, that they still understand that it is a theory. But by and large, the majority of the scientific community has embraced this belief, because that's what it is, this belief as being absolutely true. And so what happens is this next part, right? So why do atheists and agnostics consider their view to be more rational than ours? Because these two ideas are very connected to each other. They feel more rational because the institutions where reason are derived from, like we consider, the scientific community to be the source of reason. The things that they discover are the things that we accept to be reasonable and true. Especially, if we're a materialist, right? Because there's nothing beyond that. So there's no reason to go into metaphysics if we are an atheist, because there is no such thing as metaphysics, really, from that perspective. In a sense, I mean, they believe in philosophy, but it's all as it pertains to the material world. So there is no immaterial. So they consider their view to be more rational than ours because the scientific authorities agree with them. Now, this doesn't mean that they actually know the data, right? So when we're having like a civil debate with someone about the origin of the universe or the origin of man or the problem of evil or whatever it is, lost my train of thought there. They're making a simple appeal to authority. Usually, they don't usually know all the facts, involved in evolution or intelligent design or any of those the fine details of those subjects. They more just know that the scientific community agrees with them and therefore says, well, you're disagreeing with science. Not necessarily, because there are scientists that disagree with that, and there actually is a very good logical argument for something like intelligent design or whatever the issue is. And you'll discover over the course of this class that there's many ways of looking at some of these biblical views that actually pose a much better argument for why the world is the way it is than some of these atheist views. So it's a simple appeal to authority usually, which is why they think that their view is more rational. So why was Natasha shocked by the harsh responses that she was receiving? Right, so we kind of touched on this a little earlier. So she was shocked because she'd never been exposed to it before, right? So she kind of grew up in this comfortable bubble, this comfortable Christian bubble where, atheists were kind of the minority. They didn't really make a whole lot of noise. Most people just, accepted Christianity as being true, and it wasn't really challenged. But of course, in the age of the internet, all that changed. And so if you start blogging something on a public forum, you got to expect that you're going to get hit with all different kinds of views. So she just was a little shocked by that, which kind of prompts the next part. So Natasha decided to educate her on the issues to effectively respond to objections. Let me see if there was something I missed anywhere in there. Okay, so a question that I asked the class was, how can we better prepare ourselves and our kids when we encounter these kinds of attacks? And that kind of goes hand in hand with that last point, is that we want to educate ourselves on the points that the culture is bringing up, right? So if evolution is a big thing that the culture is bringing up, we want to know evolution through and through. We want to know everything that it's saying so that we know how to conceptualize it from a biblical perspective, or how to provide some sort of rebuttal to that. And then, of course, we don't want to just know know the atheist perspective. We also want to know the Christian perspective. And if there's one thing I want you to get out of this class, it's that that every point has a counterpoint. Anything that the culture brings up, always, I'm just going to go out and say that they're inventing new ways. They're constantly bringing up new arguments, but usually it's just a rehash of an old argument that was answered hundreds of years ago. But I don't want you to get the sense that if someone challenges you, that there's not an answer for it somewhere. Especially in the age of the internet, there's always an answer somewhere, and it's just a matter of you looking it up. So just don't allow it to go into that crisis of faith. Allow yourself to go into that crisis of faith mode. Because I think it's easy for that to happen when someone brings up seemingly a very good argument that seems to debunk Christianity in some way. And then my last question was, what can happen if we don't provide our kid with a well-reasoned rationale as to why we believe what we believe? So if we don't expose our kids at all to evolution, right, and the counterpoints to evolution, what happens? And really, just my simple answer to that was that the culture fills the void, right? So if we're not going to respond to something, the culture will, and it's gonna respond in a way that we're not really going to like, and it's not necessarily going to be true. It's just going to be what the culture believes. So let's kind of move on to the next slide. So this kind of brings up apologetics. I'm not going to harp on this term too much. It's just a fancy term that, let's find out what it means. So let's go to the first point. So it's first derived from a Greek word called apologia, meaning to give a defense. And so if any of you have ever heard of Socrates' Apology written by Plato, I remember when I first heard about Socrates' Apology when I was in high school, I thought it was referring to him saying he was sorry to someone about something. It actually has nothing to do with saying you're sorry. It has everything to do with giving a defense, because he was being accused of, I don't even think there were criminal offenses, but impiety was one of them. And just creating a general disturbance to the public, which, he was just asking questions. If any of you know what Socrates was doing, he was just asking questions that no one could give a really good answer to, and he embarrassed some high-up politicians, and they eventually killed him. But before they killed him, this was his defense that he gave, that Plato recorded for us. Anyway, Christian apologetics is a defense of the Christian faith. So when you think apologetics, think defense. It's a way that when the Christian faith is challenged, this is how we defend it. And just a point that I bring up. So the aim isn't to prove that Christianity is true in the sense of scientific proving, where put something in a test tube and you can prove that a chemical reaction has happened. That's not really what Christianity. What our goal is. Our goal is to provide the most rational. To provide the most rational explanation for why the world is the way it is, which we believe Christianity to be that. And so the thing is that atheists can't prove their point either in that sense, because especially if we're talking about the crux of atheism, which is that there is no God. They can't prove that there is no God any more than we can prove there is one. It'd be nice if I could just, if Jesus could manifest in the flesh and I could just show everyone, but I just don't have that, right? So that would be the way that you could actually prove it in that way. Just kind of like a nice analogy that I kind of thought up, that I thought made some sense. So I wrote this down. So atheists are committed to the idea that there is no God. Science's inability to prove God's existence does not mean God does not exist, any more than science's inability to prove the existence of germs prior to 1890 meant that germs did not exist, right? So germs, they're so small you can't see them, right? So before they were actually viewed under a microscope, it was all just theory, right? It kind of makes sense that these microbes were there because there seems to be this pattern of every time we don't wash our hands, something happens. But no one could there was no smoking gun at that point. But then in 1890, they were actually able to be viewed, and hence there we go. You could prove that germs existed, but just because they couldn't prove, quote unquote, that germs existed prior to 1890 doesn't mean that they didn't exist before 1890, right? They've always existed. It's just that they had the proof in 1890. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So this is a quote that's going to come up throughout the course. So be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you. So we're actually commanded to be apologists, to be defendants, or to be those people that make a defense for the Christian faith. So just because some people really give apologetics kind of a bad name in some circles. They say, well, you don't have enough faith, or they go down that road. And that's just not what apologetics is supposed to do. Apologetics really builds our faith, right? It's what, when we find out that there's all this evidence for the resurrection, and that there's evidence for God, that there's very good rational explanations for why God did certain things that he did in the Old Testament. We're less likely, those kinds of things, when we receive those challenges and we don't have a strong faith, they can really injure our faith. But when we have this knowledge, it really strengthens us, so that we're like those anchors that just in a hurricane they keep the ship tethered. So yeah, okay. So I think that pretty much summarized that slide. Okay, so some not so fun facts. So just don't take these statistics personally or anything. I have no idea what anyone's parenting styles are in here. For all I know, everyone's a perfect parent, and and these statistics don't necessarily apply to you. But they do give a pretty good explanation for why the culture and the church at large is in the state that it's in. So let's kind of look at some of these. So we've got 61% of kids who were involved in church become spiritually disengaged by their 20s. And what's notable about this statistic is that these are kids that were involved in church, right? These aren't kids that were nominal Christians, right? That they were born into Christianity and never went to church. These were kids that actually grew up in the church in some level, maybe even attended youth group and Sunday school, all that stuff. They became spiritually disengaged by their 20s. So why is that? So these next few statistics might give some level of an explanation for that. So we have 1 in 10 Christian families read the Bible together during a typical week. And this to me is kind of telling. And in fact, by this statistic, you would expect that 61% in the previous one to be a little higher, right? So if we're not actually reading our Bible together as a family, how can we possibly expect our kids to then take that into the world once they become adults? And I think that's exactly what's happening. So we have 10% of families that are reading the Bible together during a typical week. And this kind of, I think, directly explains the next statistic, which is that 12% of youth have regular conversations with their mom. I don't know why it specifically says mom, but that was the study. It was specifically geared towards the relationship between youth and their mothers. On faith issues. So you think about this. So if we have 10% of families actually reading the Bible together, investing in their faith, praying together, engaging in spiritual activity all at once, then once they become youth, that natural connection or that relationship isn't established for them to feel comfortable having these kinds of deeper faith-based conversations with their parents, which that makes sense. As you get into your teenage years, you're starting to break away, right? That impulse to then try to become your own person, become independent, is setting in, and so if we don't already have that spiritual relationship with our kids, it's an uphill climb then to try to do it when they're as they get older. Right, so percent of Americans identifying as Christian decreased 6% between 2007 and 2012, and at the same time, those identifying as atheists grew 4.3% in the same time period. So granted, this is an old statistic, and I don't know. I haven't really looked into seeing if this has changed since 2012. I mean, my intuition, my gut tells me it probably has. So we have almost a 10% disparity now. So we have 6% leaving, and then 4.3% becoming atheist. And then young adults make up 32% of the religiously unaffiliated, while 20% of the general public feels this way. So we can see where this is occurring, right? This is not a phenomenon of the older adult population, somewhere 30, I know I'm in my 30s too, so, and that's just like an established adult, put it that way. 30 and above. This is mostly young adults, so people in their 20s and maybe 30s are included. Who knows? So this is a young adult phenomenon. So what can we do? And this is really what this class is all about, okay? So Natasha diagnoses the lack of robust spiritual training as the cause of the Christian exodus, right? So that, remember that 10% that we're talking about. So only 10% of families, Christian families, are actually reading their Bible with their kids. And that's that's the foundation of our spiritual training, right? If we're not studying our Bible, then there's really nothing to go off of. But she goes even further, and I would agree with her on this. So she says that we need to raise our kids with a faith that is specifically prepared for the challenges that they'll face. So yes, we want to read the Bible with them. We want to show them the truth of the Bible, but then we also want to bolster that truth. With knowledge that's going to be specifically tailored to the current time. And what I mean by that is we're going to be challenged in very specific ways that we weren't challenged 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? Like all this, LGBT stuff was not really a thing, 150 years ago. So we have very different questions to answer now than they did back then. And that's what she means by specifically prepared. And this brings up something that I call the call and response principle. So we're going to answer the questions that are being asked, right? So, and kind of the way that I portray this is if we think of the gospel as a response, what might be the question or call that precedes it? And so if we consider the gospel being what Paul says in Acts 16:31, believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. What might be the question that precedes that? So that was kind of what I said in the class. So yeah, I'll give you a few, a minute or two to think about it. Not a minute, 30 seconds. And then, all right. So the question that would really naturally proceed, that would be, what must I do to be saved? If Paul is saying, this is how you're saved, so believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, it would then make sense that the preceding question would be, how must I be saved? Or what must I do to be saved? And just my question is this the main question that the culture is asking? I mean, maybe it happens occasionally, but I mean, what do you think? So something that, I really don't think that this is the primary question that the culture is asking. I think that they have other questions that once those get answered, it kind of paves the way towards maybe delivering that gospel message at some point. So the slippery slope of appeasement. Before I get into that, maybe I'll just kind of make that more concrete, that last point. So let me just kind of go back here. So questions that the culture might be asking, right? So they might some hang-ups that they might have with the Christian message. Because a lot of them just like, well, there's just no evidence for God. And so something that we're going to be doing in this class is, well, there actually is evidence for God. It just depends on what you define as evidence. Because there might not be, like I said, that smoking gun. And to demand the smoking gun, I mean, well, you might as well not believe in anything then. You can't even believe in atheism because there's no smoking gun for that either. So you're looking for your most reasonable explanation. And there are reasonable explanations for God. There are reasonable explanations for difficult things in the Bible, like slavery in the Bible, or even difficult things like genocide. Like, these are things that happen in the Old Testament, and we have to come to grips with them. So I won't go over that in this class, but we will cover that. So please don't let it hang there, just because I don't have time to go into the fine details. But these are the difficult questions that people from outside of the Christian culture are going to ask us. And if we don't address those questions, then it's going to be almost impossible for us to eventually get to the gospel message. Okay, so now that I kind of gave kind of an example for that, the slippery slope of appeasement. So we're going to return to this gospel idea from a slightly different perspective. So some churches, this is something that I've heard at certain churches, and I think this is a pretty relatively common sentiment. It's not what's the word? It's just a common sentiment that you'll hear in certain Christian circles. So we only preach the gospel here. What does this mean? And someone from class actually hit the nail on the head right away, but I'm not going to hit it the nail on the head right away. So a lot of times this message actually sounds really nice, right? We only preach the gospel here, right? We're so dedicated to our Christianity that's the only thing that we worry about, and it almost sounds noble from a certain point of view. That's not really what they're saying. Because if you spent any time in these kinds of churches, it's more the only that you have to focus on, not necessarily the gospel part. And what that is referring to is what they don't preach there, right? So we only preach the gospel here, implies that there's a lot of stuff that they don't preach there, which is other parts of the counsel of God that are maybe a little bit uncomfortable. So usually the effect of this is that there's many sermons on God's love, there's few sermons on sin or judgment, and there's absolutely no sermons on controversial issues, right? So anything that's going to potentially drive people away from the church, they're going to avoid, right? So, and this is taking what's called the seeker-sensitive model, and I should have really put that in there, but I didn't. So sorry about that. But it's a seeker-sensitive model of a church, meaning that if you have an inquisitive they're not a believer yet, but they're really curious about the Christian faith, and they come into your church, and they probably have some influence from the culture going on. You're going to avoid those issues that could potentially drive them away from eventually receiving the gospel. So, I think any one of us can think of some cultural issues that if someone just came out and started preaching them, certain people would certainly walk out of the congregation. But it's just too easy to go from seeker sensitive, and I'm not even sure there's a big difference between seeker sensitive and seeker centric, because what ultimately ends up happening is that the church becomes all about the seekers and not about the believers, right? So and we can bring up this point. So basic logic is that sermons on difficult subjects might repel non-believers from church. Right? And actually, there's a pretty valid question that is paired with that. So what happens when difficult questions are answered by the secular culture? So when we avoid sermons on sin or judgment and or controversial issues, abortion, or whatever it is, when we avoid those kinds of questions, who answers them? Well, if Christians aren't answering them, someone is, and you can be sure that the secular culture is going to swoop in and answer them. So the result of that is that our kids falsely believe that secularism is true because Christians don't have an adequate response. Our silence actually is taken as that we just don't know. And if we don't know, well, they seem to know, the secular culture seems to know, so they're going to take that as truth, which isn't good, obviously. Now the irony is that by trying to prevent non-believers from leaving, the unrooted believers end up leaving, right? So who I think of with this is like those kids or those high schoolers that are just kind of toying with they want to become Christians, but they've heard some of these other arguments and they're kind of teetering, right? But they're honestly they're most likely to become Christians if we just kind of give them that answer that they want to hear, within reason, of course. Like I said, we can't give them that test tube proof that no one can give them. But I think if we just give them some rational answers, they're going to have some responses to give to the culture when they're challenged. And so the irony is that the unrooted believers, the ones that actually want to believe, end up leaving because no one's giving them any good reasons to believe. And that's out of an effort to try to preserve those non-believers from leaving immediately. And of course, what ends up happening is that everybody leaves because the church isn't really offering anything that the culture isn't. And just the logical flow of this is that if you're not gonna give sermons on sin, or if people just stop believing in sin, right? So if there's no sin, then there's no judgment, right? If there's no sin, there's no reason to judge anyone. And then there's no need for grace. Then there's no need for Jesus, and then there's no need for church, right? So Jesus is essentially just erased. And if you erase Jesus from the church, what is the church? It's nothing. It's just a building. So you might as well just go home and watch football instead of waking up at 7 something in the morning to get the kids ready to go to Sunday school. So let's see, was there anything else in there? Yep. And I said this is why progressive churches fail, like Neville Chamberlain. So if you're a history person, you know that Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1930s Europe, in 1930s Great Britain. And he had this policy of appeasement, right? He never really provided any resistance to who? Hitler, right? So in the 1930s, he was kind of rising to power, and Chamberlain was just kind of, well, we'll just kind of give him this, give him that. We're not going to really resist him in any way. He's making he's just making concessions with him the whole time, and then eventually Hitler invades Poland, and then the rest is history. So we want to provide some level, and when I'm not talking about like physical resistance, obviously, with the culture. I'm talking about just intellectual resistance, right? So if they're providing, intellectual challenge to Christianity, we want to be able to respond with an intellectual answer. Okay, so what are we going to learn? So the most popular objections to Christianity and their Christian responses. Okay, so this class is not, I don't know if you're like gearing, you're like ready to go to, just attack some of these cultural issues going on today. We're actually not going to be addressing those, hot button issues going on in our culture today, because they honestly are, believe it or not, tangential to the Christian faith. Just bringing them up to a Christian, if a Christian is well grounded in the fundamentals of the faith, so if they're grounded in the existence of God, if they're grounded in the resurrection, the truth of the resurrection, if they're grounded in the reliability of the Bible, and then we will touch some issues like some of the really big topics like evolution. Some of the big scientific topics we're actually going to cover in this course. Those are the things. If all of those are solid, some of the cultural issues that are constantly shifting and being brought up, all those things going on the surface aren't really going to be able to touch you. And so the point of this course is to really solidify those fundamentals of the faith. And so it's going to be like sequential, right? So we're going to start with evidence for God. So we're going to have two sessions on that, and depending on how much we get through in a given day, we might have to extend it. Like I said, some of these classes are really jam-packed with information, so we might have to sip it like a tasty tea or something, or soda. I don't know, whatever you like to drink. But yeah. So sequentially, right? So then we're going to move on to Jesus, right? So we're going to talk about Jesus and all the evidence for Jesus, for the resurrection itself, for who he is, his deity, all those kinds of things. And then we're going to move on to the Bible. The Bible is just one of those things that's constantly challenged, and it's usually challenged by people that don't know what they're talking about. And this is where I say that often the culture is historically inaccurate with its understanding of how the Bible developed. Why Christians consider it reliable, because it's honestly more reliable than any other source from antiquity that we have, which we will get into that. And then finally, the last couple of weeks, we're going to talk about conversations about science, so evolution, Big Bang Theory, all that stuff, and its implications for Christianity. Okay, so it's not one size fits all. We need to tailor our conversations from person to person. So, and this kind of might seem like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth a little bit. So the whole seeker-sensitive thing, it's good to tailor your conversations on like a one-on-one basis, right? So if you know that you're talking to a Muslim, you're not going to want to, right off the bat, just like come up with, just hit them over the head with all this evidence that, Islam is, a false religion or whatever. You're going to want to be gentle in your approach to that, because you actually have, you're afforded that in that environment. One of the biggest things I think is the best way to be a representative of Christ is to just always show that you're concerned for someone, that you love them, that you care, right? And I think once you've established that, once you had that rapport, and maybe you can kind of get that out of the way, you can maybe enter into some of the more difficult subjects. But anyway. The distinction between this and the church is a different context entirely. So the point of church, right, is to strengthen the body of Christ, not to necessarily serve. Sure, we of course we want to get people into church so that they can believe in Jesus, but we can't do that if we're not strengthening ourselves. So we have to get the full counsel of God at church. And if that means that someone comes in and they hear a sermon that rubs them the wrong way and they leave, that we can't be held accountable for that. That's just them, going their own way. So, but on a one-on-one basis, we can be more sensitive to those things. So it's not one size fits all, right? So it might seem daunting to talk to our kids or just people in general about difficult issues. So just kind of the bottom line there, it says that don't force it, just don't hesitate to engage when the subject comes up. And I think a lot of this has to do with the relationship that's already been developed, right? So with our in the context of our kids, this means, right? So we want to have that relationship established from an early age. We want them to being invested in the Bible from 5, 6, 7 years old, so that by the time they're youth, that's a natural conversation for them to have. And so even some of the difficult issues, they're going to run to you before they run to someone else that maybe has a different view than they do. And in the context of just non-believers in general, right? That's what I was talking about with rapport building. So showing them that you care first when you've developed that relationship already. And I think this don't force it principle still applies. Like if they're not willing to go there to talk about the truth of Jesus, then you don't have to push it. Just keep tilling the soil, keep gardening, as one of my favorite apologists, Greg Koukl, says. We're always gardening. A lot of times it takes a long time for someone to come to harvest. So don't feel bad if you're just gardening and gardening and gardening. Okay, so you'll be surprised how often opportunities arise once you're on the lookout for them. That's Natasha Crane's little commercial pitch there, which I think we've already pretty much summarized pretty well over the course of this introductory class. So so this is really what we're going to be getting into. I have a couple quotes at the end. So one of them you already kind of heard in the beginning. So the first one's, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors as though God were making his appeal through us, right? So we're representatives of Christ. And if God's going to make his appeal through us, we want to be effective in that. And so we have to be aware of where the culture's going, what are the barriers to the culture, what's preventing people from coming to Christ, and being able to respond to those barriers in an effective manner, right? So we want to always think of ourselves as Christ's ambassadors or representatives. And then the second one's the one you already heard. So, but in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, right? So we always want to be able to give a reason as to why we have hope in Jesus, right? And the more ways that we can give that defense, just the more people that we'll be able to get to see. Some people have very different brains. Some people want to hear that emotional argument of the relationship that you have with Jesus, your faith, and just how strong it is, and that's going to be really effective for some. Some people are more on the intellectual side, and they're going to want you to kind of answer some of their intellectual questions before you're going to actually be able to deliver that message of faith to them. So I'm really excited to go over this stuff with you. It's going to be a fun class, just hope you're able to come out and enjoy it along with the rest of us. And so I will see you on Sunday. We're going to be this is going to be the first class of conversations about God. So we'll talk about all sorts of fun evidences for the existence of God. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. God bless everybody.